everyone, and welcome to video lecture 10, looking at ASEAN economic cooperation and integration, the ASEAN economic community and beyond. So in seminar 9, we looked at the progression of ASEAN economic cooperation and integration from the establishment of ASEAN itself right up to the ASEAN Charter. In this video lecture, we are going to examine the AEC and what ASEAN wants its integration, economic integration, to be in the future. So let's recap the important issues that we have seen in ASEAN economic cooperation and integration through the years, right? What are their priorities? What do ASEAN members want to do? What are the key issues in ASEAN economic cooperation and integration? And what are the hurdles? What are these challenges? Because we know that there have been so many criticisms about ASEAN economic cooperation and integration, but what exactly are these substantive hurdles? And more importantly, what is being done to tackle these hurdles so that we can achieve what we set out to achieve, right? So some of these issues, is it regional cooperation and integration versus, unilateralism, sovereignty, a more nationalistic outlook, right? Different ASEAN member states have different national priorities and different national economic policies. Obviously, these are going to be in tension with the regional cooperation and integration goals. Of course, on one hand, it is good and there is a net good of, economic cooperation and integration, but in the immediate present, the transition to working out regional goals is difficult, right? Because we all have our national policies, and these are also very important to us, to the ASEAN member states. So there will always be this tension of national policy versus regional law, right? So the fact is, there is always going to be this tension. How do we find a common ground? How do we find, a compromise, right? And this could be hindered or aided by consensus and the ASEAN-X decision making. We also know that in ASEAN economic cooperation and integration, the end goal is that we want to be a single market and production base. This is seen in the Bali Concord II. This is repeated in the ASEAN Charter. This is repeated also in both in the ASEAN Economic Blueprint of 2007 to 2015, and there is a slight change in terminology, but the idea is still very much the same in the incumbent blueprint, ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025, right? We also see certain progressions and developments. Things that have always been important now may become even more important, such as equitable development, right? So that everybody, ordinary citizens, residents, have a slice of the development pie. So we need to understand what this equitable development definition and end goal are. We also need to see, in terms of enforcing compliance, right? The eminent persons group wanted the dispute settlement, or saw the dispute settlement mechanism as a very important part of, ensuring and enforcing compliance. But we now know that none of the dispute settlement mechanisms have ever been used. So there needs to be another way of enforcing compliance. And what ASEAN member states have found is that we need to improve monitoring and evaluation, right? The reporting mechanisms. And this is seen through quite an ineffective scorecard in the early years of the ASEAN community, and then moving towards the new M&E monitoring and evaluation framework. These frameworks will help facilitate implementation and compliance. There is also treaty making, where we look at sovereignty, how broadly worded it is. So again, we need to come to terms with tensions between sovereignty and regionalism, right? And what the challenges to ASEAN integration are. And there still exist non-tariff barriers and non-tariff measures. So if we look at, or take a step back and look at the types of economic integration models, the Balasa models that we see in the seminar sheets and the seminar questions, which we need to examine more closely. We also need to see the fundamentals, what these fundamentals of economic integration are. What is it exactly that ASEAN member states wish to achieve, right? And what they wish to achieve doesn't mean that they will get there so easily, because ideals are one thing, actual, realistic, practical implementation is another thing. And we also need to juxtapose this with power, law, institutions, and of course, our national frameworks. In our national frameworks, we have, what is our national political framework? Do individual ASEAN member states accept the national pains of integration? Because the same way that globalization is heralded as a positive, that it will bring national economies higher, at the same time globalization is not easy. There are transitional pains of globalization, plugging into the world markets. So the same way, when there is regional integration, of course there's going to be a net positive outcome, but the transitional pains can be immense, and not everybody, not every member state, or not every citizenry will have the appetite of continuing to the very end, of the transitional pains to emerge with the positive gains, right? And then, because there are transitional pains in economic integration, we need to look at the second point. Are there? How will there be? Long-term commitment of the parties, right? Is it long-term commitment in law, as seen in the implementation, as seen in the growth and strengthening of the institutions, right? What are these long-term commitments in law and in fact, right? And if there's no long-term commitment, what are the consequences? Right? What are the impacts of, varying commitment to economic integration? Because economic integration, this is a long-term project, right? So there are going to be consequences if not everybody gets into the car and follows on the journey. And of course, economic integration is going to be hampered by the disparities in the development and capacities of the individual ASEAN member states. Not everybody is at the same economic level, and so all this but the outcome is the same. We are reaching, an economic community end goal. So how do these disparities, how can these be overcome? And what is the common ground we can get so that we can all prosper together, right? And then looking at the national level, what is our economic order? Is the national economy of the ASEAN member state more internationalized industries, or are there, it's a more private capital, capital markets, greater privatization, free market type of economy? All these factors play into the efficiency and effectiveness of economic integration, right? And then what is the degree, coming back to the fundamental question, what is the degree of economic integration that ASEAN members want? Do they want it to be very holistic, very comprehensive, or is it more selective, more limited, but at a very, kind of profound level, that they want small type of integration, but go very deep, right? And are we all going to move together? So I always come back to this, are we always going to move together, right? Because this is a common reality and practical kind of drawback that we see in economic integration, that not everybody is on the same page at any one time. So there's going to be, someone to get it to be in the car, the economic integration car, for the entire journey, someone to get off and then get on, right? So are we going to move together, or would it be better to have different speeds, multiple speeds of economic integration? That means those who wish to go first, move first, and then those who will want to join up later, join later, right? But the end goal is that everybody needs to be on the project together, despite multiple speeds. And also there needs to be credibility and transparency in the economic integration project. So let's look at the Balasa model that we talked about briefly in seminar 9, but let's look at it more profoundly here. So Balasa has this classical model of regional integration, and he gives 5 types. It might be, these 5 types may be in stages, but I want to highlight to you that, certain regional integration projects may choose to be only one model and not move further, right? So what are these 5 types? The free trade area, which is, for example, the ASEAN free trade area. So in the free trade area, all the tariffs and quotas are eliminated among member states, but not against third states, outside trading parties. One step up from a free trade area is that all the member states would then impose a similar external tariff structure against non-members. So for example, the Eurasian Economic Union, comprising the ex-Soviet states, they are a customs union, right? Yeah, the customs union, because they have an external tariff structure. So that means if any ASEAN member state wishes to trade with the Eurasian Economic Union, they will meet a similar tariff, whether they, trade with Belarus or they trade with another Central Asian country, or Kazakhstan, for example, right? Then another step up is like a common market, which is what the European communities was, right? Another step, free movement of factors, so it's not just trade and services, but free movement of all economic factors that will help the common market, to make it a common market. And then even one step further, national economic policies in an economic union that are harmonized. So that, and towards that end, you see total economic integration, where within this regional economic bloc, it looks like a federal state, it looks like one holistic country, right? As I want to emphasize, there are certain regional integration projects that move through these 5 stages to kind of, reach a union or reach total economic integration. But there are other types of regional integration projects that choose to be only a customs union, or or like ASEAN, to be only a free trade area, okay? Or, or free trade area plus. So now we look at another kind of idea of economic integration. So moving on from Balasa, we look at Pelkmans. We have already examined Pelkman in Seminar 9. So Pelkman has a more kind of contemporary approach to stages of economic integration, which, mirrors Balassa, but is also more resonant with our contemporary international economic order. So I think Pelkman is more, it's easier to understand vis-a-vis ASEAN. So he gives 5 kind of regional integration types in his typology, right? The first is a free trade area, which we have seen. Another is a customs union. Another one is a free trade area plus, right? So you're a free trade area, but you have the additional criteria of, full WTO compliance, or you can even have a customs union. You might want to go a step further where, it's a free trade area or it's a customs union, but it's very deep, very comprehensive. You really remove your, TBTs and SPSs, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And then there's free movement of services, especially, the higher level kind of services like financial sectors. And then, or you might even want to be a common market like free market in goods, services, labor, and capital. So remembering that in Seminar 9 and Video Lecture 9, we saw that services, financial sectors, liberalization of labor markets and capital markets, these are very sensitive because they're high value, right? So there is a lot of national protectionism around them, and understandably so. So the deeper or the bigger you go in your economic integration, the more sensitive areas that you would want to protect nationally would have to be eased off for the regional integration project, right? So, and an example of the common market are federations, like I said, for like countries or the EU. So, in Pelkman's kind of typology, in his 5 model typology, which one do you think is ASEAN most similar to, right? Now, if we think that ASEAN, in economic integration is like a free trade area, ASEAN certainly does not want to become a customs union, or because all ASEAN member states are WTO members, so ASEAN economic integration is arguably, an FTA plus, then what is it that ASEAN economic integration is trying to achieve, right? What is our AEC Design and Rationale? The rationale, as we have already understood in Seminar 9, is that we want to have greater trade flows. We want to attract greater investment so that we can, trade better among ourselves, trade better with the rest of the world. Single market and production base, we produce so that we can trade with the rest of the world. So in economic terminology or political economy terms, we attract more FDI, attract more investment, then we generate higher value added, there's greater economic development, greater prosperity for all in the country and across the region, right? So there's this, like flying geese model where from, low developing countries, we produce more and better higher level goods, because you can see in this structural transformation of East Asia, we start with garment industries, then we do, more intensive like steel, then we do higher grade products like TVs, we don't have videos now, but then, HD TVs, flat screen TVs, higher tech type of goods, right? And the higher value type of goods you produce, the better prices and greater income you can you can have, right? And we are also looking towards, as ASEAN develops economically, we need to become more competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world, right? And because we are still developing economies, we recall what the Eminent Persons Group said in the report, in the 2007 report. ASEAN wants to, be single market and production base, be more competitive so that we can compete with China and India. China is already very, very developed in its economy. It produces high-level goods. India is also a very big, market, and it's also a big producer. So just to show you, this is where and what we are trying to achieve, right? We want to have higher value added goods, right? And the higher value added goods we have, the more we earn. Yeah, so you can see research and development, branding, these are high value goods. And if we are logistics, if we are in service, right, rather than distribution, if we are in the higher level services type of industry, we will earn more. The more labor intensive your industries are, you produce more, but then you may earn less, right? So in terms of manufacturing. So generally speaking, developing economies want to move higher and higher up the global value chain. So what do we want? Now we have seen, just to recap what we have seen, ASEAN economic cooperation and integration. We know, we kind of understand where ASEAN wants to be in terms of its economic integration, right? What it wants to produce and where it wants to go and why it wants to integrate, because it wants to really, truly develop and become competitive. So with all this in mind, we need to tackle the law more profoundly. Where do we see the law to make our economic integration dream come to life? And we see this in not the Bali Concord II. Yes, the Bali Concord II was the beginning of the dream, right? But we see this in the ASEAN Charter, our treaty obligation. Article 1.5 says, we want to be a single market and production base. We want to be more effective in trade and investment so that we can have free flow of goods, services, and investment. We need to have greater facilitation of, movement of business persons, which is, services, professionals, talents, labor, and freer flow of capital markets, right? Remembering that it is a very highly developed industry and it's also quite protected. Now, we see the 4 pillars of the ASEAN Economic Community. So, from the ASEAN Charter 2007, 8 years later, we established the ASEAN Community, of which the central pillar is the ASEAN Economic Community. By the end of 2015, the AEC is established together with the APSC and the ASCC. All right. In the 4 pillars of the ASEAN Economic Community, we see certain tracks. Yes, we know that the overall aim is single market and production base, but what does single market and production base mean? In the 2015 blueprint, it says free flow of goods, free flow of services, free flow of investment, free flow of capital, so on and so forth, right? The second pillar of the AEC 2015 is that we need to be competitive. How can we become competitive? So we need to have, anti-monopoly, anti-oligarchies, a better competition policy. We need to have greater consumer protection, greater IP protection, greater, to be more competitive, we need to have better infrastructure, better taxation protocols, more e-commerce. Then, of course, we need to have, equitable economic development. There's no use if we develop economically and the people do not participate partake, do not enjoy in this development. So this equitable economic development is to share the spoils, to share the gains, right? SME development, small, medium enterprise development, and the IAI, the Initiative for ASEAN Integration, which is, which pertains really to the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. Vietnam is really much more developed now, but CLM countries are still very much part of the IAI. And then the fourth pillar is that integration of global economy. We grow not only, good for our national economies, not only good for our people, but we also need to be relevant to the rest of the world, right? So there needs to be integration into the global economy. We plug into the global supply chains, right? Global supply network. So what are the relevant instruments? This is something that we talked about towards the end of Seminar 9. But apart from the ASEAN Charter, we see the ASEAN Blueprint, right? 2015, right? Up to the time of the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community. And together with the ASEAN Blueprint, we need to see ARTIGA, the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, right? And then the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, ACIA. And then we have the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services. We have ARTISA, yeah, and which is now formalized and being signed, right? ARTISA 2019. And then we also need to see the EDSM and consensus and to compare it with, the hurdles of consensus and also competing forum of the WTO mechanism, right? And now we have the AEC Blueprint 2025. Is there any difference between AEC Blueprint 2025 and the AEC Blueprint 2015, right? And there's now the AEC CSAP, the Consolidated Action Plan, the economic action. So now we know that these economic instruments, we also know our economic vision, our end goal. Let's look at the nuts and bolts, the substance. The single market and production base. What is, right? Single market, what does ASEAN mean by having a single market and production base, right? Does it mean a regional market with common policies? Is it very consumer-minded? What are the comparisons did it take, the ASEAN take, the single market terminology from the EU, right? We talked about this briefly, but we need to know this in depth. Then the production base, right? Does it mean that we are a common base to attract foreign investment and to compete better with China and India? Or do we compare ourselves with NAFTA, right? Do we, in comparison with NAFTA, do we look at the output and do we look at, the benefits to companies and workers? And then goods, what are we looking at? So we know that ARTIGA, the ASEAN Free Trade Area Agreement, right? So we set tariffs. ASEAN member states can set tariffs on non-ASEAN originating goods. ASEAN is not customs union, right? For ASEAN originating goods, we need at least 40%, right? So ASEAN member states apply tariff of 0 to 5% for the goods according to the rules of origin, right? So free trade area, goods can move freely, it's a 0 to 5% tariff, right? CLMV members have a delayed implementation deadline, right? Like in ASEAN minus X. And the goods that are covered, all goods are covered, so it's quite comprehensive under ARTIGA. But, sensitive products, agricultural products are accepted. And of course, we have looked at it briefly. The general exceptions still apply, such as public health, safety, morals. The ASEAN Free Trade Area for goods is generally considered to be fully implemented. But of course, we know that even if it's considered to be fully implemented, there are still flaws in the free flow of goods, right? So Article's objective is the free flow of goods, but we still see barriers, right? Retention of non-tariff measures, and then technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. To explain why NTBs and NTMs are so problematic for ASEAN, because there is very little transparency, the lists are also very long, and through a policy research paper over the COVID-19 pandemic period, it was shown that non-tariff measures and non-tariff barriers actually increased in ASEAN, in the ASEAN free trade area. So all these are very problematic, because if in theory and in fact that we have a free trade area, but our NTMs and NTBs preventing a very efficient, effective, ASEAN free trade area. What are some of the hurdles to removing NTBs and NTMs? It could be, yes, as we saw, the lack of transparency, the very long list, heightened protectionism during pandemics, maybe a lack of coordination, lack of clear approaches, lack of capacity, or maybe even a lack of political will to follow up with, action. What are we looking at? The ACIA, the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, it benefits individuals, corporate entities. There should be national treatment, most favored nation treatment. It pertains mainly to senior management, skilled services. So, this Comprehensive Investment Agreement doesn't apply to lower level types of persons or industries. It's for higher level kind of investments, right? There are expropriation, prevention and protection clauses. Of course, dispute resolution is very, very important. And as usual, we also see certain for services, which is another very sensitive area. There's national treatment for services, right? There's basic standards under WTO GATS, and then which is further liberalized. ATISA we now have the ATISA, but it's not yet in force. Yeah, so we still work under the AFAS agreement. Yeah, and what is AFAS looking at? There is mutual recognition for professional qualification. So if you think about it, this means that doctors from Myanmar can work in Singapore, engineers from around the region can work in one another's countries, so on and so forth, right? Nurses, like Filipino nurses can work in the medical industries of the ASEAN member states. Financial services, so on and so forth. It's a separate management because it's quite protected, as we said. But generally speaking, there are priority sectors in the services liberalization, such as business, telecoms, education, e-ASEAN, healthcare. Now we look at production base, right? And there are problems in the ASEAN production base. We do want to plug into the global supply chains. We want to produce better and trade better, right? But there are still problems, right? Because again, lack of transparency and clarity, perhaps lack of focused agenda for improving production networks. But this is a hurdle that is progressively being addressed, right? And the factors are shared with the problems seen in the single market, right? We need to remove non-tariff measures. We need to modernize our customs, to move towards ASEAN single window. We need to avoid double taxation, right? So you can't really say we have a free trade area and then still continue to tax, yeah? Beyond the law, there may also be policy domains or policy factors which impede the ASEAN production base. So, it could be customs procedures are very inefficient, it takes a very long time, there's so much paperwork, or there's even like kickbacks, corruption, right? If you don't pay me a few $1,000s, I'm not going to approve your goods coming into my country, right? And of course, there is the ASEAN cross-border infrastructure. So this is gradually being improved as well. It's a constant improvement process. So like I mentioned previously, transport networks, transport is a very expensive, venture. So once we improve our infrastructure, the single market and production base will gradually improve. So with all that, we see the, all those hurdles, but also the progressive improvements. We see the establishment of the ASEAN Economic Community. So the real data is a little amorphous. The ASEAN Secretariat said that there was 93% implemented, but under the Asian Development Bank, it was only 82%. So there is still very little transparency on what was done and what the exact, implementation rate is. So if there's still so many hurdles to the ASEAN Economic Community, how can we improve it? Again, we need to look at our good friends, implementation, enforcement, monitoring, and dispute settlement. The challenges in implementation and enforcement. What does implementation mean? We need to know the laws, right? We need to implement the treaties. How do we make sure that soft laws like the Blueprint are implemented? What if states do not want to comply with soft laws, right? And then our enforcement mechanisms are weaker in comparison with what we see elsewhere in the world, right? There are such hurdles. How can we overcome them? We saw the scorecard, right? And obviously, every member state needs to implement. And to monitor, we originally had the AEC Scorecard. But because the AEC Scorecard was not very effective, we now have the monitoring and evaluation framework after the AEC was established. So from 2016 onwards, thankfully, we now have the M&E framework. That was a project aided by the World Bank and Australian aid. And there are also other foreign funders. Implement and comply better in its economic integration. So what are the flaws of the AEC scorecard? There are many, right? It's self-monitoring and it's self-reporting. So, people can report only good things. And it's peer pressure and reputational pressure only rather than real punitive action. And even though it was supposed to be quite regular, only 2 were published, right? So you can see the scorecard itself as a monitoring mechanism to make sure implementation improved. The AEC scorecard was itself not very well implemented. So there are many drawbacks to the scorecard, which we need to understand. And you can see these are some of the drawbacks of of self-reporting, because everybody gave themselves pretty good grades on implementing, right? Yeah. So to improve the very clumsy scorecard, we now have the M&E framework. And we saw in the earlier seminars, the M&E framework comprises 3 key prongs: compliance monitoring, outcomes monitoring, and impact evaluation, right? compliance monitoring, we need to make sure that member states comply. After they comply, we must check that there are actually positive outcomes. And positive outcomes for the member states and the region, that's not enough, because we need to examine the impact evaluation. Has ASEAN economic integration benefited ASEAN people, or has economic integration adversely affected ASEAN people, right? So that's impact evaluation. These are the details for the M&E framework, right? It is managed by the ASEAN Integration Monitoring Directorate, and it also works in tandem with many other divisions within the ASEAN Secretariat, right? Apart from producing data and surveillance, it provides high-level policy and technical advice. So now we are professionalizing our monitoring, right? So this is really integral to our successful economic integration in ASEAN. So now we take a flashback at 4 pillars of the AEC 2015. Yes, AEC was established in 2015, but at the same time there were many criticisms and there were many, right? So now there's an improvement for the next 10 years, or at least since 2016 to 2025, the next 10 years we see the AEC Blueprint 2025. Instead of 4 pillars, we now have 5 pillars. They basically mean the same thing, right? Different terminology, but mean the same thing. Integrated, highly cohesive economy, right? We need to have competitive ASEAN, resilient, people-oriented ASEAN. So that's going towards equitable development, greater connectivity and sectoral cooperation, and global ASEAN, which maps out into the global supply chains. So we have a table here, comparing AEC 2015 and 2025. Yeah, you can see there is only one addition: enhanced connectivity and sectoral cooperation, because they found that in the first 7 years, 8 years, many ASEAN sectors were working in silos. It can't be an integrated region if we do not work together. So improvements in this new AEC phase, moving towards 2025, we are reaching out to the private sector. We remember that in the early stage of ASEAN economic cooperation in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, private sector was not, they always said they wanted to engage, but in practice, the private sector was not fully engaged. Even in the first phase, up to 2015, ASEAN really didn't engage with the private sector. So this lacuna is being addressed. There's a lot of pressure from the private sector to partake of the advantages of the ASEAN economic integration, right? Better transparency, better information, better monitoring will enhance implementation and transparency, right? And with all these improvements, we will make deeper efforts to make towards building ASEAN into a more integrated market that is connected with the rest of the world. And with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to a better ASEAN economic community in 2025.